Good evening, and welcome. Tonight we're going to step into a time when the world felt both familiar and terrifyingly fragile, when ordinary routines, bread baking, market chatter, church bells, ships docking, families sleeping in one room, could suddenly be interrupted by something invisible, unstoppable, and deeply misunderstood. Our story is about the Black Death, the Great Plague pandemic that swept across continents and reshaped daily life, belief, labor, trade, fear, and memory in the 14th century. We won't rush. We'll move slowly, like a lantern carried through a dark street, noticing details that people usually skip. How a town sounded at dawn, how a port smelled after rain, how rumors traveled faster than carts, how prayers and business continued until they couldn't, and how a disaster became part of the everyday. If you're here to relax, to listen, or to drift off while history unfolds like a long, quiet river, you're in the right place. Let's begin. Before the Black Death becomes a number, before it becomes a sentence in a textbook, before it becomes an image of masked doctors and empty streets, it begins as ordinary life continuing, calmly and stubbornly, in thousands of places at once, because that is what life always does until the moment it cannot. People wake up with the same aches they had yesterday, they stretch stiff fingers, they put on wool and linen, they check the sky, they feed the animals if they have animals, they step around puddles if it rained, they glance at the horizon for weather and for news, and then they get to work, because work is not something you discuss, it is simply the structure holding the day together, and without it the hours fall apart. In the early 14th century, Europe is not one world, but many small worlds stitched together by roads that are sometimes good and often terrible, by rivers that carry barges and gossip at the same slow speed, and by seas that are dangerous but profitable, because a ship that survives can turn salt, cloth, grain, spices, timber, and wine into money, and money into influence, and influence into protection. A person might spend their entire life within a few kilometers of the place they were born, and yet their life is still connected to distant regions by trade, by taxes, by pilgrimages, by wars fought in someone else's name, and by church announcements that speak of faraway disasters as if they are moral lessons delivered to the local population in a language that feels half divine, half bureaucratic. Cities are growing, but not cleanly, not in straight lines, not in the neat patterns that later planners would wish for. A medieval city is layered like a long-used kitchen. Smoke-blackened, damp in places, crowded with tools and people and smells, the old wall patched, the new wall half-finished, the streets narrow, the buildings leaning toward each other as if trying to keep warm, the upper stories jutting out to steal space from the air, the ground floors filled with workshops where cloth is cut, leather is scraped, metal is hammered, and bread is shaped by hands that have done the same motions for years. Water is carried, dumped, spilled, and reused. Animals and humans share spaces. Waste is a constant issue, not because people enjoy filth, but because solving filth requires infrastructure and coordination is expensive, and expensive things require power, and power requires agreement, and agreement is rare. In villages, the rhythm is older, tied to seasons and daylight. The fields are not abstract, they are life itself. A bad harvest is not an inconvenience, it is hunger. Hunger is not just an empty stomach. It is weakness, and weakness is sickness, and sickness makes work impossible, and when work becomes impossible, the entire household can begin sliding toward ruin, one missed task at a time, Many regions in Europe had already endured difficult years in the early 1300s, including periods of famine, and even when the immediate crisis passed, the memory of it stayed in the body, in the way people stored food, in the way they feared late rains, in the way they counted children and wondered how many mouths could be fed if winter was harsh. Religion is everywhere, not as a separate topic, but as the air people breathe, as the explanation for why the world is arranged as it is, and why suffering exists, and why the rich are rich and the poor are poor, and why disease happens, and why prayers sometimes feel answered and sometimes feel ignored. But religion is not the only force shaping behavior. Markets shape behavior. Lords shape behavior. Guilds shape behavior. Family shapes behavior. And fear, quiet, practical fear, shapes behavior too, because life is uncertain, and uncertainty means you learn to watch for signs: a cough that lasts too long, a neighbor's sudden absence, a strange swelling, a dead animal, a rumor from a traveler, a ship that arrives without its usual noise of sailors shouting and barrels rolling. The Black Death, when it comes, does not come as a labeled event. It does not announce itself politely. It arrives the way many catastrophes arrive. First as distant news, then as confusing local incidents, then as a growing pattern that people resist believing, and then as a new reality that forces itself into every conversation and every decision. To understand how something like this can spread, you have to picture the world as connected by countless small threads. A merchant moving from one town to another is a thread. A pilgrim walking to a shrine is a thread. A soldier marching with a unit is a thread. A ship traveling from port to port is a thick rope of thread, because ships carry not only people and goods, but also food supplies that attract animals, and animals that carry insects, and insects that are indifferent to borders. Medieval people are not ignorant of contagion in the modern scientific sense, but they have observations, and their observations are sometimes sharp and sometimes wrong, because they lack microscopes and germ theory, but they do not lack eyes. They notice that disease can follow trade routes. They notice that crowded places suffer more. They notice that bad air, rotting smells, and damp conditions seem to coincide with sickness, and they build theories around what they can perceive, because what you can perceive feels more believable than what you cannot. In some places, when the first severe cases appear, a few people might think it is just a worse version of an illness they already know. Fevers happen. Swellings happen. People die. Life is full of death. The cemetery is not hidden behind silence, it is part of the village landscape, part of the town's edge, part of the churchyard that everyone passes. But there is a difference between death that feels normal and death that feels like the world is suddenly tilted, and one of the most frightening aspects of the Black Death is speed, the way a person can be functioning and speaking and walking, and then within a short span of time be too weak to stand, and then be gone, leaving behind not only grief but also a terrible practical question. What do we do now, and who is next, and how do we keep eating, and how do we bury bodies, and how do we keep the household from collapsing? When the plague spreads into a region, it spreads unevenly, because the world is uneven. Some villages are struck hard, others are spared for reasons no one can fully explain at the time. Some neighborhoods in a city suffer heavily, other streets are quieter. And this unevenness fuels superstition and suspicion, because people crave patterns, and when the pattern is unclear, the mind invents one, and invention can be comforting or cruel depending on what it chooses to blame. But before we reach the peak of fear, before we reach the scenes of emergency, the story still begins in motion, with ships and caravans and roads, with the slow, steady system of medieval trade doing what it always does. Moving goods from where they are produced to where they are desired. The Black Sea and the Mediterranean are crucial zones in this story, not because medieval people have a map labeled plague route, but because these seas connect different economic worlds, and economic worlds create regular movement, and regular movement is exactly what a fast-moving disaster requires. Imagine a port city at the edge of the Mediterranean, not as a postcard, but as a living machine. The smell of salt and fish, the creak of wood, the snap of rope, the noise of bargaining, the deep fatigue on the faces of sailors who have been at sea long enough to stop caring about comfort, the piles of goods that represent money turned into objects. Ships carry grain, which is life. They carry cloth, which is livelihood. They carry spices, which are luxury and medicine and status. They carry metalwork and tools. They carry letters and instructions. They carry stories of distant places, and stories are a kind of cargo too, because stories change behavior. A rumor about war can change prices. A rumor about disease can change whether a ship is welcomed or feared. At first, the rumors do not all match. Some say there is a sickness in the east. Some say there is something strange in the lands beyond familiar borders. Some say entire towns are affected. Some say it is punishment. Some say it is poison. Some say it is bad stars. Some say it is simply a season of illness, worse than usual, and it will pass. And as these rumors travel, they pick up details like dust sticking to a damp cloth, because people add what they believe makes sense. A priest might emphasize sin and punishment. A merchant might emphasize trade disruption. A doctor might emphasize air, balance, and bodily humors. A soldier might emphasize enemies and sabotage. Everyone filters the same fear through the lens they already have. Meanwhile, normal problems continue. Taxes are collected. Debts are owed. Children are born. Weddings happen. A farmer worries about the condition of a horse. A baker worries about flour quality. A city council worries about water supply. Life continues because it must, and because stopping life requires agreement that something is truly abnormal, and agreement takes time, and time is exactly what the plague does not offer. The phrase, Black Death, is a later label, and even during the 14th century, people might not use a single consistent name for what they are experiencing. They described symptoms. They described sudden death. They described swellings, fevers, the way the skin can change, the way a cough can appear, the way blood might be involved, the way people seem to fall like grain under a scythe. They search for words and metaphors, because metaphors are the mind's first attempt to domesticate terror, to put it into a familiar shape. In homes, the question of care becomes immediate. A family is an economic unit, not just an emotional one. If the mother becomes sick, who cooks? If the father becomes sick, who negotiates? If a child becomes sick, who watches the other children? If a grandparent becomes sick, who lifts them? And if multiple people become sick at once, then there is no surplus of strength. The household becomes a small boat in rough water, and the sickness is not just one wave, it is repeated waves. People sometimes stay to care for loved ones. Sometimes they flee. Sometimes they try to do both. They keep distance but deliver food, they leave a sick person with water and a prayer, they hold their breath in a room and then run outside and breathe as if air could wash guilt away. Communities respond in different ways based on their structures. Some towns attempt early forms of isolation, though not with the modern understanding of microbes, but with the practical understanding that closeness seems dangerous. Some shut gates. Some restrict travel. Some require certain waiting periods for ships. Some create rules for burial. Some attempt to regulate gatherings. But enforcement is difficult. People break rules when they are hungry. They break rules when they are afraid. They break rules when they believe the rule is unfair, or when they believe the rule will not help them anyway. And then there is the emotional texture of it, which is easy to overlook if you only count deaths. The emotional texture is the way the air feels in a street when the usual noise is missing. The way a bell sounds different when it rings too often. The way people begin to speak more quietly, or more loudly, depending on whether they are trying to control fear or drown it. The way jokes become sharper or disappear. The way neighbors avoid eye contact, not out of hatred, but out of a strange logic: if I look too long, I might see it coming for me. If you could stand in a medieval city just before the worst arrives, you might notice small signs of strain. The number of funerals. The speed of funerals. The way the clergy looks tired. The way doctors and barber surgeons become busy. The way certain herbs, certain incense, certain protective objects become more common, because people buy what they can buy when they cannot buy certainty. You might notice that people argue more about causes, because argument is a way of trying to take control. If we can name the cause, we can respond, and if we can respond, we can feel less helpless. But the cause is not simple in their framework, and so multiple causes compete, and each cause suggests a different enemy. Bad air suggests cleansing. Sin suggests repentance. Poison suggests punishment of suspects. Bad stars suggest resignation. And all of them can coexist in one person's mind, because fear does not require logical consistency, it requires relief. In the broader world, political and military pressures still exist. Conflicts continue. Rulers still demand resources. Armies still move. And movement is again the key. Movement is how commerce lives, how war functions, how messages travel, and how plague rides unseen. A single infected person, or a single flea on a rat, or a chain of exposures, can connect a distant outbreak to a local tragedy in a way no one plans and no one can easily stop. Now, when historians talk about the Black Death, they often try to trace origins, and routes, and timelines, and those are important, because understanding requires structure. But for the people living it, the first stage is not a map. The first stage is a whisper: someone in the next town is sick. Then another whisper: the next town is not just sick, it is burying many. Then a louder whisper: a merchant says the port is afraid. Then the fear becomes practical: the market has fewer people. Then it becomes personal. Someone in your own street closes their shutters and does not open them. And that is the moment, the quiet turning point, when the Black Death stops being distant history and becomes the immediate world, when people begin to look at each other not only as neighbors and co-workers and relatives, but as possible danger, and when even kindness becomes complicated by risk. For our story, we're going to move gradually from that early moment of rumor and unease into the fuller picture, how the disease likely traveled, what people believed about it, what daily life looked like in towns and villages under pressure, how authorities attempted to respond, how medicine and religion interacted, how fear reshaped communities, and how, after the wave passed, the world that remained was still medieval, still familiar, but changed in ways that would echo for generations. But before we dive into those turning points, let's slow down and hold the scene steady for a little longer, because the most important thing to remember is that the Black Death did not strike a world that was waiting for it. It struck a world already busy, already strained, already living, and that living world is what makes the disaster meaningful, because what is lost is not only life, but normality itself. So picture an ordinary morning again. A narrow street. A wooden door. A person stepping outside with a bucket. A distant bell. A cartwheel in mud. A shopkeeper lifting a shutter. A child coughing, but children cough all the time, and no one wants to assign meaning to it yet. A neighbor nods. Another neighbor avoids getting too close, but tells themselves they're just in a hurry. A traveler passes through and says something that sounds like exaggeration, and people half laugh, half worry. And above all of it, the sky is the same sky, indifferent and calm, which is sometimes the most unsettling thing about catastrophe. The world does not look like it is ending, even when it is beginning to break. And now, with that ordinary morning in mind, we can start to follow the threads that connect it to the larger movement of the plague, because the Black Death is not only a story of sickness, it is a story of connection, and how connection, which usually brings prosperity and culture and exchange, can also bring ruin when the thing being exchanged is unseen. If part 1 was the quiet morning before the storm, part 2 is the moment the wind becomes real, not as a dramatic roar, but as a steady change in ordinary details, fewer footsteps on the street, a different tone in conversations, a small hesitation before shaking hands, a ship that arrives with too much silence, a marketplace where people stand a little farther apart without fully admitting why. When we talk about how the Black Death spread, the story is often told like a straight line drawn across a map, but real movement is messy, like spilled ink that finds every crack. The medieval world is not global in the modern sense, yet it is connected enough that a fast-moving disease can travel farther than most individuals ever will, because it does not need a passport, and it does not need to understand language, and it does not get tired. What matters most is not a single route, but repeated patterns of travel, ships moving between ports, caravans moving between market towns, armies moving between borders, and seasonal work pulling people into cities and pushing them back out again. A city is not just a location, it is a pump, pulling in grain, cloth, labor, and money, then pushing out manufactured goods, ideas, and sometimes, without meaning to, danger. From a modern perspective, many historians and scientists describe the Black Death as a plague pandemic most commonly associated with Yersinia pestis, carried through networks that could involve rodents and fleas and human-to-human spread in certain forms. Medieval people did not know that. But they were not passive. They observed. They guessed. They argued. They tried things. And the tragedy is partly that some of their observations were correct in a practical way, even if the explanation behind them was wrong. They noticed, for example, that ports could become places of sudden fear. A ship arriving is usually an event: news, goods, wages, noise, gossip. But during the early waves of plague, a ship could become a question: do we welcome it, because we need what it carries, or do we treat it like a floating threat? Trade is a hunger of its own. A city needs grain. It needs salt. It needs timber. It needs cloth. If you block ships, you might block sickness, but you might also block survival, and authorities have to choose between different kinds of risk, often with limited information and no time to be sure. So, the first big pattern is that coastal cities and major ports often become early pressure points. When a rumor says, something bad happened in that other place, the rumor is not just a story. It becomes policy debates, prayer services, price shifts, and private decisions. A merchant might decide to delay a journey. A sailor might decide to take a job anyway because hunger is louder than fear. A city council might argue late into the night about whether closing gates would protect the people or starve them. And while those decisions are being debated, movement continues, because movement has momentum. A ship leaving one port does not stop existing just because the destination has new worries. A caravan cannot easily turn around. An army cannot easily pause. And individuals, messengers, monks, laborers, craftsmen, still have reasons to travel that feel necessary in the moment. In the medieval imagination, air is often treated as a carrier of danger. People speak of miasma, corrupted air, especially when illness seems to cluster in crowded, damp, or foul-smelling places. Whether or not that is the true mechanism, the behavior that follows is still meaningful. If people believe air is dangerous, they seek fresh air, they burn incense, they carry herbs, they avoid certain streets, they open windows, they flee to the countryside, and those actions change the shape of society, sometimes helping, sometimes harming, often simply shifting risk from one place to another. Because another uncomfortable truth is this: fleeing can be both reasonable and disastrous. If you stay in a crowded city while illness rises, you are close to more people, more shared surfaces, more enclosed spaces. If you flee, you might leave the densest danger behind, but you might also carry the danger into villages that had less exposure until then. Medieval people sense this, too, and it creates moral tension. Should you stay with your community and risk yourself, or should you protect your household by leaving? There is no clean answer. Every choice has a cost, and people pay costs in ways that are not always visible from the outside. As the plague begins to appear in multiple places, daily life starts changing through small adjustments first. Markets become quieter. Some shops close not because the owners are sick, but because customers are gone. Church attendance may rise for a time, because fear draws people toward ritual and meaning, but later it can fall when gatherings feel unsafe or when clergy themselves are overwhelmed. Work becomes irregular, because labor depends on bodies, and bodies are suddenly uncertain. This is the slow transformation, a society built on routine begins losing routine, and when routine weakens, everything else becomes harder. Bread is still needed, but flour deliveries might be delayed. Water is still needed, but the people who carry it might be missing. Burials still need to happen, but the normal systems for burial might strain under repeated loss. The more strain builds, the more the city feels like a machine running without enough oil. Authorities, in many places, begin experimenting with controls that feel modern in spirit, even when the reasoning is not modern. They limit travel. They restrict gatherings. They create rules about who may enter or leave. Some places try to separate the sick from the healthy. Some try to create dedicated spaces outside city centers. These measures are never perfect, but they show an important point. Medieval communities are capable of collective action, and they can invent public health behaviors even without modern science, because necessity forces invention. One of the most famous long-term results of these experiments is the development of quarantine practices, particularly associated with certain maritime cities that had the administrative capacity to enforce waiting periods for ships. The logic is simple even without germ theory. If danger arrives with travelers, then waiting might reveal whether danger is present. Time becomes a tool. Waiting becomes a barrier. And barriers, even imperfect ones, can slow the spread. But slowing is not the same as stopping. Because plague does not need a single dramatic entrance. It can arrive through a small leak, one person, one cargo hold, one cluster of contacts, one chain of transactions that looks normal until it isn't. The medieval economy is full of touch points, places where many hands meet many objects. A market stall. A tavern. A shared well. A church doorway where people pass close together. A workshop where apprentices and masters breathe the same air for hours. And in the middle of all this, there is also the question of belief. When something terrifying arrives, people search for reasons that match their worldview. Some interpret plague as divine punishment. Some interpret it as fate written in the stars. Some interpret it as the result of human malice, poisoning, conspiracy, enemies. Those interpretations matter, because they create different responses. If the cause is sin, the response is repentance and ritual. If the cause is stars, the response is resignation or astrological remedies. If the cause is enemies, the response can become suspicion, violence, and scapegoating. This is one of the darkest social side effects of large disasters, when fear becomes hungry for a target. Communities under stress sometimes look for an explanation with a face, because an invisible cause feels unbearable. Rumors can turn into accusations. Accusations can turn into punishment. And the tragedy is that punishment does not remove the plague, but it can remove trust, and once trust is removed, cooperation becomes harder, and cooperation is exactly what communities need to survive. Now, zoom in again, from large patterns back to daily life, because that is where boring history becomes strangely powerful. Picture a household in a city. One room, maybe two. A fire for cooking. A corner where tools are kept. A small pile of food stores. A family is not just parents and children, but often apprentices, cousins, elderly relatives, sometimes lodgers. In that space, the idea of distance is almost impossible. If one person becomes ill, the household becomes a single unit of risk. People do what they can, they open windows, they clean more, they pray, they seek herbal remedies, they avoid outsiders, they whisper instructions to children about what not to touch. Outside the home, social life changes shape. The street becomes less playful. The tavern becomes less crowded. The jokes become rarer, or sharper, or forced. People listen more carefully for bells. They pay attention to who is missing. In normal times, a missing neighbor might mean travel. In plague times, missing means a question you don't want to ask out loud. And then there is the labor question, which is quietly revolutionary. When many workers are gone or afraid, labor becomes scarce. Scarcity changes bargaining power. People who survive may find they can demand higher wages, better terms, more respect. Landlords and city authorities may try to freeze wages or enforce old obligations, because they fear losing control. The result is tension. Not immediate transformation everywhere, not a simple before and after, but the beginning of a shift. If society loses a large portion of its workforce, the survivors become economically important in a new way. This is one of the strange paradoxes of catastrophe: it destroys, and then it rearranges. It does not create justice automatically, but it disrupts old patterns. Some people become poorer. Some become unexpectedly better off. Some inherit property. Some lose everything. Some institutions weaken. Some strengthen. And in the middle of it, ordinary people still try to do ordinary things, because even during disaster, people still need to eat, still need to sleep, still need to care for children, still need to make decisions about tomorrow's bread. In many towns, the role of the church becomes both essential and strained. Clergy are expected to provide comfort, rituals, last prayers, and explanations. But clergy are also human, and they can become exhausted, overwhelmed, and afraid. When institutions strain, people begin improvising, private prayers, informal rituals, new forms of devotion. In some places, extreme public displays appear: processions, vows, collective acts, attempts to show unity and to persuade fate or God or the universe to stop the suffering. At the same time, medicine is present, even if limited. Medieval medicine is not nothing. It is a system with logic. Humors, balances, diets, environment, astrological timing, and a long tradition of texts and practices. Physicians offer advice: avoid certain foods, avoid overexertion, seek clean air, maintain calm, use specific herbs, cleanse living spaces. Some advice is helpful. Some is not. But the key point is that people are trying to build control out of the tools they have. And as the plague continues, another transformation happens: time changes. Normally, time is measured by work cycles, market days, religious calendars. During plague, time can feel measured by new markers: how many days since someone was last seen, how many bells today, how long until the next ship arrives, how long until the illness moves on. The future shrinks. People make decisions with shorter horizons. Next month becomes less meaningful than tomorrow morning. This shrinking of the future affects everything. Contracts, marriages, travel plans, debts, disputes. People rush some decisions and postpone others. Some become more generous. Some become more selfish. Some become numb. Some become intensely religious. Some become intensely practical. There is no single, plague personality. There are millions of small human responses, each shaped by class, family, location, and luck. And luck is a word we should not be afraid to use here, because from the perspective of individuals, survival often looks like luck. Two households can do similar things, and one suffers more. Two neighborhoods can have similar conditions, and one is hit harder. People search for reasons, but sometimes the reasons are not visible. By the end of this part, we've moved from rumor to pattern, from pattern to policy, from policy to daily life shifting under pressure. We've also set up the next phase of the story, the period when the plague is no longer something people debate, but something they organize their entire existence around, and when society must decide how to function while fear sits at the table during every meal. In Part 3, we will slow down even more and walk through a plague-struck city almost hour by hour in an imagined, historically grounded way, not to sensationalize, but to show how systems break. How food distribution changes, how streets sound, how councils issue orders, how households adapt, how burial practices shift, how relationships between neighbors change, how the economy stutters, and how, even in that, people still do small normal things, because the human brain clings to normality the way a hand clings to a rail in a storm. And we'll keep the tone steady and calm, like a long night watch, where the goal is not to frighten you, but to understand how a medieval world experienced the unthinkable, one quiet day at a time. To enter a plague-struck city in the 14th century, you do not need a dramatic gate or a thunderous soundtrack, because what changes first is not the skyline, but the rhythm, and rhythm is something you notice only when it breaks. The walls are still there, the towers still cast the same shadows, the church still stands where it always stood, the market square is still the market square, but the city's sound is altered, as if someone turned down the ordinary noise and left behind only the thin, sharp noises that feel too clear, a cartwheel in mud, a bell in the distance, a single dog barking where there used to be many voices. Imagine it is early morning, that gray hour when light is present but not yet warm, and the city is awake because it has to be awake, because bread still needs to be made, water still needs to be carried, and animals still need to be fed, but it wakes more cautiously than before, like a person opening their eyes slowly, hoping the nightmare has passed, and realizing it has not. Doors open later. People step outside and look down the street before committing their whole body to the outside world. Some windows remain shuttered not because the residents are lazy, but because they are absent, or ill, or afraid, or simply trying to make their home feel like a fortress against an unseen threat. The street itself looks familiar: uneven stones, damp patches, narrow gutters, the occasional pile of debris that no one has bothered to move, but the street also feels like a place where you do not linger. In ordinary times, a street is social space. People pause. They barter. They gossip. Children play. A neighbor calls to another neighbor, and the distance between them is small because closeness is normal. In plague time, closeness becomes a question that never fully leaves the mind, and even when people do not have a scientific reason, the instinct of avoidance can still grow, because the simplest rule fear can invent is, less contact, less danger. In the marketplace, the first difference is not emptiness, because a city cannot stop eating, and food is still dragged into public view, but the difference is the shape of movement. People approach stalls like they are approaching something hot. They choose quickly. They speak less. They do not linger to compare. They do not lean close to smell the fruit for too long. The sellers, too, move differently. They watch their customers, not only to prevent theft, but to read danger in body language. Is this person sweating? Are they coughing? Are they too pale? Are they too quiet? Are they buying too much? Are they buying for someone who cannot come outside? Prices shift in strange ways. Some goods become scarce because the supply chain stutters. Some become cheaper because there are fewer buyers. Some become more expensive because fear itself has a price. Practical items that people believe can protect them, certain herbs, incense, strong-smelling substances, oils, may become popular, and popularity can turn into shortage. And shortage can turn into rumor, and rumor can turn into panic buying, which then becomes a self-fulfilling crisis. Not only does disease disrupt normal life, but fear disrupts it further. Now look at the workspaces, because plague is not only a medical event, it is a labor event. A workshop depends on hands, and when hands are missing, a workshop becomes quiet. A smithy without apprentices is not a smithy with a slightly smaller team. It is a smithy that cannot maintain the same heat of production. A cloth workshop without enough spinners, carders, dyers, and weavers is not a slower business. It is a chain with missing links, and chains with missing links break. So you begin seeing signs of pause, fewer deliveries, fewer finished goods, more unfinished work left where it was last touched. The city council, the officials, the guild leaders, and the clergy all meet more often, not because they feel confident, but because meeting is what institutions do when they are scared. They write orders, announce rules, negotiate exceptions, argue over enforcement, and in many cases their power is limited by something very simple. You cannot command healthy workers to do risky work if they believe the risk is too high, and you cannot command hungry people to obey rules that stop them from earning bread. Authority becomes a constant balancing act between protection and practicality. So the city starts to develop a new kind of public speech, proclamations about cleanliness, about gatherings, about travel, about who may enter or leave, about what to do if someone becomes ill. These proclamations might be shouted in squares, read at church doors, posted on gates. They are attempts to turn chaos into a sequence of steps, because steps feel safer than uncertainty. Even if the steps are imperfect, even if the logic behind them is flawed, the act of giving steps is a kind of comfort. It says, we are not entirely helpless. But comfort is unevenly distributed, because the plague strikes within a society already divided. A wealthy household may have more space, more stored food, more ability to withdraw. A poorer household may have none of that. The poor cannot isolate easily, because isolation often requires resources, separate rooms, stocked supplies, the ability to stop working. So risk is also shaped by class, not as a moral punishment, but as a practical inequality. And yet, The plague does not only target the poor. It moves through networks. It touches clergy, merchants, officials, craftsmen, servants. It rearranges social expectations because it does not behave like a crime you can prosecute or a war you can negotiate with. It behaves like a pressure on everything at once. In churches, the atmosphere becomes heavy in a specific way. Candles burn. Incense rises. People pray for protection, for mercy, for meaning. Confession becomes urgent. But religious life is also strained by the simple fact that spiritual care requires presence. A priest is expected to visit, to comfort, to perform rituals. That expectation can collide with fear and exhaustion. Some clergy continue their duties at great personal risk, driven by belief, duty, or compassion. Others withdraw. Some die. Some flee. None of this is a neat story of heroes and cowards. It is a story of humans under pressure, each making decisions that feel survivable. Meanwhile, the medical world, limited as it is, becomes more visible. Physicians, barber surgeons, healers, herbalists, each offers guidance. They talk about air and balance and diet, about avoiding certain conditions, about maintaining calm, about cleaning spaces, about burning aromatic substances, about separating the ill when possible. Some advice may reduce exposure in practice. Some advice may be merely symbolic. But symbolic actions matter because they structure fear. When the mind has no control, it grabs what looks like control. If you move through the city at midday, you notice another shift, the way people look at strangers. In ordinary times, strangers are common in cities, they bring trade, news, novelty. In plague times, strangers bring questions. Where did you come from? Why are you here? Who do you know? Have you been near illness? And because those questions cannot be answered with certainty, suspicion becomes a shadow that follows movement. This is where communities sometimes begin making harsh decisions. Certain groups may be blamed for the plague, accused of causing it, punished for it. Fear looks for targets. Targets become scapegoats. And scapegoating is a tragedy layered on top of tragedy, because it adds human cruelty to natural disaster. It also reveals something important. When the normal explanations fail, people sometimes choose explanations that feel emotionally satisfying, even if they are wrong, because wrong certainty can feel better than honest uncertainty. But even in the middle of fear, life continues in small stubborn fragments. Someone still sweeps the doorstep because a swept doorstep is a memory of normal. Someone still tries to teach a child a craft because the craft is the family's future, and the future, even if it feels smaller, still exists. Someone still writes a letter. Someone still repairs a shoe. Someone still argues over money. Someone still laughs briefly, then feels guilty for laughing. The city is not only dying. It is trying to remain itself while being forced to change. As the days pass, one of the heaviest pressures becomes logistics. How does a city handle the practical tasks of care and separation? How does it handle the disruption of labor? How does it handle food supply? And how does it handle the end of life in a way that preserves dignity and order? Here we should be careful with tone, because it is easy to sensationalize, but the historical truth is already heavy enough without drama. In many places, normal systems of burial, record-keeping, and community rituals become overwhelmed. That does not mean immediate collapse everywhere, but it does mean strain, and strain shows itself in speed, in simplified procedures, in fewer ceremonies, in officials trying to keep up with reality. And when ceremonies shrink, people feel something else besides fear. They feel robbed of the usual way of grieving. Grief normally has steps: gathering, speaking, ritual, burial, shared food, shared memory. When those steps are interrupted, grief becomes lonelier, and loneliness becomes another kind of sickness that spreads quietly. Now, consider the countryside around a city, because cities do not exist alone. The countryside feeds the city. The city sells tools, cloth, and services back to the countryside. When plague hits the city, the countryside feels it through demand shifts, through fewer buyers, through fewer stable prices. When plague reaches the countryside, the city feels it through shortages. It is a loop. And loops are dangerous during crisis, because a problem in one part of the loop becomes a problem everywhere. This is also where the labor shift becomes sharper. Survivors begin to realize they are needed. Land needs workers. Workshops need workers. Households need servants. Demand for labor rises when labor is scarce. Some people gain negotiating power, even if they do not speak of it in those terms. They simply say, if you want me to work, you must offer more. You must offer better terms. You must offer respect. And those demands can shock elites who are used to fixed hierarchies. Authorities respond with attempts to freeze the world in place. They may try wage controls. They may try to enforce old obligations. They may punish refusal, as if refusal is a moral failure rather than a rational reaction to danger. Tension grows. Not everywhere equally, not all at once, but enough that later generations will see the plague not only as a time of death, but as a time when social relationships began to shift under pressure. As this part closes, let's return once more to the city street at evening. The light fades. Smoke hangs low. A bell rings again. A household closes its door and tries to make the inside feel safe. Someone counts their food. Someone whispers a prayer. Someone tells a child to sleep. The child asks if tomorrow will be normal. The adult pauses, because normal is a word that has become uncertain, and then the adult answers with whatever kindness they can shape out of fear. Yes, we will do our best, we will wake up, we will eat, we will endure, because endurance is sometimes all a society has when explanation fails. In Part 4, we will move into the peak period more carefully, focusing on three things without sensational detail. First, how different social classes experienced the same crisis differently. Second, how responses, religious, medical, political, competed and combined. And third, how the aftermath began immediately, even before the plague fully passed, because the world starts rebuilding while it is still breaking, and that rebuilding changes the medieval future in ways people cannot yet see. By the time a plague wave reaches its highest pressure in a community, the most striking thing is not only fear, but adaptation, because human beings adapt even to conditions they never imagined, and in that adaptation you can see the hidden structure of society, the way different people experience the same disaster as different realities, because they stand in different places inside the social machine. A wealthy household, for example, may experience the plague as a tightening of the household perimeter, a turning inward, a decision to reduce contacts, to send servants for errands, to rely on stored supplies, to retreat into larger rooms with more air and more distance, and to treat the outside world as a risky zone that should be crossed only when necessary. Their fear is real, but their fear is cushioned by resources, and resources translate into choices, and choices translate into a sense. Sometimes false, sometimes partially true, that control is possible. A poor household, on the other hand, may experience plague time as a narrow tunnel with no side exits, because distance is a luxury, stored food is a luxury, the ability to stop working is a luxury, and even the ability to relocate is not simple when you have little to carry and nowhere certain to go. In crowded housing, the plague is not just a threat, it is a constant presence in nearby rooms and nearby breaths, and survival becomes not a matter of good planning but a matter of trying to keep the household functioning day by day while the world outside becomes less reliable. Between these extremes, there are craftsmen, shopkeepers, apprentices, sailors, clerks, and servants, each living in a different balance of risk and necessity. A craftsman who owns his tools may be able to pause work for a time, but pausing work burns through savings quickly. A servant in a wealthy household may be protected by the household's stored food, but also trapped by duty, required to move through risky spaces on behalf of others. A priest may be honored and expected to appear everywhere, but the honor becomes weight when exhaustion and danger accumulate. A city official may have authority, but authority becomes blame when people are frightened and need someone to point at. This is how plague becomes social pressure, not only biological pressure. It tests relationships. It tests obligations. It tests whether the rules people believed in can survive reality. In many towns and cities, religious responses become more visible, and not only in the sense of private prayer, but in the sense of public behavior, because public behavior is how communities show themselves that they are still communities. People gather for processions, for collective vows, for days of fasting, for services that ask for mercy, for explanations that make suffering feel meaningful. And the tone of those gatherings can shift over time. Early on, gatherings may feel intense but hopeful, as if the right ritual performed sincerely could persuade the universe to soften. Later, gatherings may feel heavy, because repetition without relief changes the emotional atmosphere, and people begin to ask quieter questions, like whether they are being punished, or whether the world is simply dangerous in a way that cannot be negotiated with. At the same time, the church itself is under strain as an institution. Clergy are expected to serve, yet many die, many become exhausted, and administrative gaps appear. When gaps appear, communities improvise. Lay people take on certain roles informally. Local traditions intensify. New devotional practices become more common. Some people become more pious. Some become angry. Some become distant. Some become practical and emotionally numb. A disaster does not make everyone the same, it spreads through different personalities like water through different soils. Medical responses also intensify, and here it is important to treat medieval medicine as a real system of thought rather than a joke, because although it lacks modern microbiology, it is still a structured attempt to make sense of bodies and environments, and it still produces guidance that can shape behavior. People are advised to avoid corrupt air, to keep living spaces as clean as possible, to avoid crowds when possible, to moderate diet, to stay calm, to burn aromatic substances, to carry protective herbs, to seek balances of heat and cold, dryness and moisture. Some of these actions might reduce exposure indirectly, others might not. But even ineffective remedies have social power, because when people feel helpless they cling to habits that offer a sense of agency. And then there are the political responses, which are often quieter than the dramatic stories but more enduring. Councils issue regulations. Ports enforce waiting periods. Travelers are questioned. Households are sometimes marked in ways meant to warn others. Certain goods may be restricted. Certain gatherings may be limited. The city becomes more rule-heavy, because in crisis, rules become a substitute for certainty, and leaders hope that a strict pattern of behavior can function like a wall against chaos. But rules also create conflict. A rule that stops gatherings may be seen as necessary by some and intolerable by others. A rule that restricts travel may protect the city while harming merchants. A rule that restricts markets may reduce contact while creating hunger. Enforcement becomes uneven, and uneven enforcement creates resentment, and resentment spreads like its own kind of illness, quiet and persistent. Now, we should also talk about the emotional economy of rumor, because during plague time, rumor becomes a major force shaping behavior. Rumor fills the space where official information is absent or distrusted. People listen to travelers. They watch ships. They interpret small signs, an absence, a closed shop, a bell ringing too often. And they build stories. Sometimes the stories are partly true. Sometimes they are false. But the key is that the stories change decisions. Rumor can make people flee early. Rumor can make people hoard. Rumor can make people refuse to help neighbors. Rumor can make people accuse strangers. Rumor can make people attempt protections that do nothing. Rumor can also, sometimes, spread useful caution. Avoid certain places, be careful, do not crowd, keep distance. A medieval community does not have modern public health messaging, but it does have social networks, and those networks carry both wisdom and panic. This is also where scapegoating becomes a dangerous outlet for fear. When an invisible threat arrives, some people look for visible blame. Accusations can spread fast. Communities under stress can become cruel. And cruelty can become organized, especially when leaders or agitators use fear to gain control or to redirect anger away from authority. It is one of the bleak patterns of human history. Disasters can reveal compassion, but they can also reveal the ease with which suspicion becomes violence. Still, amid these heavy currents, daily life continues in fragments. A baker still rises early, because bread is still demanded. A tailor still stitches because clothing still tears. A farmer still works because fields do not pause for grief. A mother still calms a child, because children still need sleep. People still fall in love. People still argue. People still tell stories at night. The plague does not erase humanity, it rearranges the conditions in which humanity moves. Now, one of the most significant shifts during the Black Death is how people begin to think about work, value, and time. When labor becomes scarce, the meaning of labor changes. A worker who was previously replaceable now becomes difficult to replace. A craft skill becomes precious. A farmhand becomes precious. A servant becomes precious. This does not instantly create equality, but it creates negotiation. Survivors may demand higher wages. They may refuse old obligations. They may leave one lord for another. They may move to towns where opportunities exist. They may inherit tools, land, or positions because someone else is gone. This is the beginning of the post-plague economy taking shape while the plague still lingers. Elites, meanwhile, often try to preserve the old order. They pass wage controls. They attempt to bind workers to contracts. They punish idleness. They frame negotiation as moral failure. They appeal to tradition. They appeal to law. They appeal to the idea that society must remain stable. And stability becomes a battlefield word, because for some people stability means survival, and for others it means oppression, and those meanings collide when the world has already been destabilized by death. In homes, inheritance becomes a practical and emotional storm. Property changes hands suddenly. Tools, land, shops, debts, obligations, everything shifts. A younger person may become the head of a household sooner than expected. A widow may inherit responsibility and risk. A child may become valuable as an heir and vulnerable as a dependent. Family structures tighten or fracture. The plague does not only kill, it scrambles relationships. It also changes memory. People begin remembering years not by harvests or festivals, but by the plague's presence, the year it came, the year it returned, the year it quieted. Trauma becomes part of the calendar. Survivors carry fear forward. They may react quickly to later outbreaks, sometimes with better caution, sometimes with panic learned from pain. And in all of this, there is a quiet philosophical shift that is hard to measure but easy to feel, the sense that the world is not as stable as people pretended. Medieval society already knows death well, but the scale and speed of plague makes death feel less like an individual event and more like an environmental condition, like weather that can enter the home. That changes how people talk about life choices. Some become more focused on religion. Some become more focused on pleasure. Some become more focused on building wealth quickly. Some become more focused on protecting family at any cost. A mass disaster multiplies priorities rather than unifying them. As this part ends, we are standing at the point where the plague is still active, but the future is already changing. The institutions are strained. The economy is shifting. The culture is absorbing fear into daily habits. People are learning new rules of distance and contact, new rules of trust and suspicion, new rules of what counts as normal. And behind all of that, the medieval world is still medieval, still full of carts and bells and candles and bread ovens, but it is becoming a slightly different medieval world, one shaped by a shared memory of vulnerability. In Part 5, we will move into the aftermath in a slow, detailed way. How towns tried to restart trade, how families rebuilt households, how wages and laws became battlefields, how art and religion absorbed the trauma, how repeated outbreaks kept the fear alive, and how the Black Death became not only a catastrophe, but a turning point that quietly reshaped the long path toward the later medieval and early modern world. When the worst wave of plague begins to recede in a town, it does not end like a storm that suddenly stops and reveals blue sky. It ends more like a long illness inside the body of the community, where symptoms lessen but weakness remains, and the person who survives is not the same person who existed before. The city does not wake up one morning and announce, with confidence, that the danger is gone. It wakes up and notices that the bells ring less often, that fewer doors remain sealed, that there are small movements of ordinary life trying to return, cautious and uncertain, as if normality has become something that must be practiced again. In the early aftermath, one of the first visible changes is simple absence. There are gaps in streets where familiar faces used to be. There are empty stalls in the market. There are workshops with the same tools but fewer hands. There are homes where the fire no longer burns. And absence is not only emotional, it is structural. A city is a network. When too many nodes disappear, the network changes shape. Some services cannot operate the way they did. Some crafts lose their masters. Some guilds lose key members. Some parishes lose clergy. Some neighborhoods lose the people who handled certain tasks, like carrying water, maintaining gutters, repairing roofs, or distributing goods. The survivors are surrounded by a strange combination of relief and exhaustion. Relief because they are alive, because the immediate pressure feels lighter. Exhaustion because fear has been constant, because grief has piled up, because routines have been broken and must be rebuilt. And rebuilding does not begin with grand speeches. It begins with sweeping a floor, repairing a door, reopening a shop, planting a field, re-establishing a delivery schedule, relearning how to trust a crowded place without feeling that trust is foolish. At the same time, the plague does not vanish permanently. In many regions, it returns in later years, sometimes in smaller waves, sometimes sharply, and that possibility shapes behavior. Even when the city appears calm, people carry a memory that makes them alert. A sudden sickness can produce an immediate shift in mood. A rumor can spread faster than before, because now rumor has proof behind it. The community has learned what can happen, and learned knowledge changes the nervous system of a society. Now, economically, the aftermath creates a world of contradictions. In some ways, the survivors inherit opportunity. In other ways, they inherit burden. There are more resources per person in a narrow arithmetic sense. More land available, more wages possible, more positions that need filling. But there is also disruption, trade networks damaged, skills lost, households fractured, debts tangled, and the constant possibility that the plague can come back again. One of the most discussed changes is labor scarcity. Fields still need workers. Cities still need craftsmen. Lords still want rents and productivity. But there are fewer people to do the work, and fewer people means bargaining power can shift. A farm laborer can demand more because replacing him is difficult. A skilled craftsman can demand more because his craft is essential. A servant can negotiate because households need functioning help. And negotiation is not only about money, it is also about mobility. People can move. They can leave one employer for another. They can seek better terms. Mobility becomes a kind of quiet leverage. For elites, landlords, city authorities, guild leaders, this shift can feel like disorder. They may see higher wages as a threat to the old hierarchy. They may see worker mobility as disrespectful. They may see negotiation as rebellion. And so, in many regions, the post-plague period produces legal and political attempts to freeze the economy in place, to force the world back into its old shape. This is where you see laws and ordinances aimed at controlling wages, restricting movement, forcing workers to accept certain terms, punishing idleness, and reinforcing old obligations. Authorities often frame these controls as stability, as necessary for the common good, because stability sounds moral. But from the perspective of workers, stability can look like being forced to carry the costs of a disaster while the powerful try to protect their profits. This tension becomes a long-running thread. It is not only about numbers, it is about dignity. The Black Death shifts not just the supply of labor, but the perception of value. When you realize that society cannot run without your work, it becomes harder to accept being treated as invisible. That realization does not instantly create equality, far from it, but it plants seeds of social change, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, sometimes delayed by force. In the countryside, changes appear in land use. If there are fewer people, some marginal lands may be abandoned because they are too labor-intensive to maintain. Pasture may expand relative to crops in some areas, because livestock requires different labor patterns. Landlords may consolidate holdings. Some peasants may gain access to better land or better terms. In some places, rural communities can negotiate reduced obligations. In other places, lords respond with heavier pressure, trying to extract the same income from fewer tenants. The countryside becomes a landscape not only of fields but of negotiations, quiet conflicts, and shifting power. In cities, guild structures can also shift. Apprenticeships are affected by missing masters. Some craft knowledge becomes scarce. Some shops change ownership through inheritance. Some widows continue businesses because someone must, and necessity can open doors that custom would have kept closed. The old moral story says society is fixed, the post-plague reality says society is flexible under pressure, though that flexibility is uneven and often fought over. And then there is the psychological aftermath, which historians sometimes describe through changes in art, religion, and cultural mood. When a community experiences mass death, it changes the way people think about time. The future feels less guaranteed. Life feels more fragile. Some people respond by becoming intensely religious, seeking salvation and order. Some respond by becoming more focused on earthly pleasures, because if tomorrow is uncertain, today matters more. Some respond by becoming more financially driven, seeking security through wealth. Some respond by becoming more cynical. Some respond by becoming more compassionate. The plague does not produce one moral lesson. It produces many, sometimes contradictory, because humans are complicated. In religion, you can see both increased devotion and increased questioning. Some people are drawn deeper into ritual. Others are disappointed by institutions that seemed unable to protect them or explain suffering convincingly. The authority of clergy can be strengthened by heroism and care, and weakened by absence or failure, depending on local experience. This creates a patchwork of faith, trust, resentment, and longing. One subtle but important shift is administrative learning. Even when medieval authorities do not understand germs, they do learn patterns of crisis management. They learn the power of restricting travel. They learn the economic consequences of shutting markets. They learn the difficulty of enforcing isolation. They learn that fear can cause flight, and flight can spread trouble. They learn that cities need plans for burial, for care, for order under stress. This learning does not create a modern health system, but it creates institutional memory, and institutional memory becomes a foundation for later measures in later outbreaks. As years pass, the Black Death becomes something like a background presence in the medieval world, a reminder that catastrophe can return. Communities develop habits, watchfulness, quick response to rumors, sometimes seasonal caution. The plague becomes part of the environment in a psychological sense. It shapes how people interpret other events. A bad harvest plus rumors of sickness can trigger fear faster than before. A traveler's cough becomes more alarming. A ship arriving late becomes more suspicious. But it is not only fear. There is also rebuilding. People marry again. Markets stabilize. New apprentices enter workshops. Fields are planted. Houses are repaired. Children grow up not remembering the worst days directly, but living inside the stories of those who survived. The society, as a whole, creates a new normal that includes the memory of disaster. In some regions, that new normal includes higher wages, more mobility, and tension with elites. In other regions, elites successfully reassert control. The outcome is not uniform. Europe becomes a mosaic of post-plague realities. And this is why the Black Death is a turning point, not because it magically modernizes everything, but because it forces a recalculation of labor, authority, faith, and everyday risk. It makes people and institutions react, and reaction changes the future, even if no one intends it to. In the long view, the Black Death contributes to shifts in economic structures, to pressure on feudal arrangements, to changes in urban life and rural management, and to the psychological landscape of Europe. But in the small view, the view that matters for our boring history style, it is also about a quiet morning after the worst wave, when a person steps outside and hears fewer bells, and notices a strange mixture of relief and emptiness, and wonders how a city can feel both alive and haunted at the same time. Because that is the truth of aftermath. It is not a clean reset. It is living with holes in the fabric and learning to stitch around them, even when the cloth will never be exactly the same. In Part 6, we will follow two parallel paths. First, a deep, slow look at how a single household might rebuild its daily routine after loss, and second, a broader look at how repeated outbreaks keep the plague present for generations, shaping laws, trade, and social expectations. We'll keep it calm, steady, and detailed, focusing on everyday systems rather than dramatic scenes, because the everyday is where history actually happens. To understand what comes after a plague wave, it helps to stop thinking in terms of society as a single thing and start thinking in terms of households, because a household is where history becomes physical. A household is food and fire and sleep and work. It is who wakes first, who carries water, who earns coins, who keeps children from wandering into danger, who remembers where the flour is stored, who knows which neighbor will lend a tool, and who, if missing, creates a silence that the entire home cannot ignore. So, imagine a household in a medium-sized town. Not a palace, not a hovel, but something common, a small structure with a workshop space below and sleeping space above, or perhaps a single room divided by furniture and habit. Before the plague, the routine is simple and repetitive, which is how life stays stable. Someone rises early. Someone lights the fire. Someone checks the day's needs: bread, water, work materials, deliveries. Children are guided into tasks. An apprentice is told what to do. A spouse negotiates with a neighbor about a small purchase. It is not glamorous, but it is life. During the worst weeks, routine collapses into emergency. Afterward, the household tries to rebuild the routine, but it discovers that routine is not a button you press. Routine is made of people. If the people are gone, the routine cannot be the same. Perhaps the father died. Perhaps an apprentice died. Perhaps a cousin who lived with them died. Perhaps the mother survived but is weakened. Perhaps the children survived but are frightened. In that household, rebuilding begins with the most basic question: who does what now? The same tasks exist, but the distribution changes. A child may take on adult work sooner. A widow may become the head of a business. An apprentice may become a primary worker earlier than planned. And these changes are not announced with ceremony. They happen because the bread still must be made, and if it is not made, the household does not eat. This is one of the quiet engines of post-plague change. Necessity creates new roles. Now add the outside world. The neighbors are also changed. The local network of favors, debts, small trades, and mutual help has been disrupted. The person who used to repair shoes might be gone. The person who used to deliver firewood might be gone. The person who used to watch children for an hour might be gone. And the new person who tries to fill that role might charge more, or might not yet be trusted, or might not exist at all. So the household becomes more self-reliant in some ways, and more dependent in other ways. It may store more food, if possible, because memory teaches caution. It may avoid crowded places longer than necessary. It may keep children closer. It may become suspicious of strangers. It may become more generous to neighbors, because shared trauma can create solidarity, or it may become less generous, because fear can create hoarding. Different households choose different strategies, and those strategies shape the future social texture of a town. Now look at the town itself. After the wave, there is often an awkward moment when institutions attempt to restart normal operations. Markets reopen fully. Guild meetings resume. Courts try to function. Taxes are demanded again. Rents are collected. But the population is altered. Many debts are now confusing because debtors or creditors have died. Many contracts become disputed. Many properties have unclear ownership. And officials, already short-staffed, must solve disputes in a world where documentation may be incomplete and emotions are raw. This is where you see a growth in administrative work, and sometimes a growth in conflict. Who owns this shop now? Who inherits this land? Does a widow have full rights to continue a trade? Does an orphan owe old obligations? Should rents be reduced because tenants are fewer? Should wages be controlled because employers feel threatened? Every one of these questions becomes a point of tension. And tension is not only legal. It is personal. A landlord who depended on rents may feel desperate and angry, trying to maintain income. A tenant who survived may feel newly bold, refusing old terms. A craftsman may demand higher pay. A city council may attempt wage controls. Enforcement becomes a test of power. Can the old hierarchy still command obedience when it is now clear that people can leave, negotiate, or refuse? In some regions, worker mobility increases. People move to places with better terms. They choose employers. They leave lords. They seek cities that need hands. This mobility is historically significant because it shifts the balance in subtle ways. Even if laws try to restrict movement, the pressure of scarcity makes restriction difficult. You can punish some people, but you cannot punish everyone if your fields still need planting and your walls still need repairs. Now, the plague does not remain absent. In the decades after the initial catastrophe, outbreaks recur. Some are smaller. Some are sharp. The recurrence creates a pattern. The plague becomes a periodic visitor. This means that the society is never fully done with it. It lives with the possibility. Living with the possibility changes behavior in long-term ways. Towns may maintain certain practices, monitoring newcomers, watching ships, limiting certain forms of contact when rumors rise, developing temporary rules quickly. People may keep stronger habits of storing supplies. Wealthy people may keep countryside retreats more deliberately. Poor people may form informal mutual support networks, or may become more vulnerable depending on how the local economy shifts. This recurring pattern also shapes culture. The plague becomes part of storytelling and memory. It enters sermons. It enters moral lessons. It enters local chronicles. It becomes a reference point in conversation. Before the plague, after the plague, during the last sickness. It becomes a shared historical marker, like a great fire or a war, but deeper because it touches every household. Art and symbolism absorb it too, not necessarily as constant explicit imagery, but as a change in tone. A heightened awareness of death can appear in religious art, in the way time is represented, in the themes that become popular. But again, culture is not uniform. Some regions lean into solemnity. Some lean into celebration. Some become more disciplined. Some become more restless. In addition to cultural shifts, there are practical changes in how communities treat space. Crowded housing remains crowded because population loss does not automatically create better buildings, but over time, scarcity of labor and changes in wealth distribution can lead to different building patterns. In some towns, property becomes cheaper. In other towns, certain buildings are consolidated. Some abandoned areas are reclaimed. The physical shape of a town can change slowly, as if the plague has loosened the old arrangement and time is slowly reknotting it. And then there are the long-term economic effects. With fewer people, demand for food changes. Some landlords shift from labor-intensive crops to pasture. Wool production can become more attractive in some places. Trade patterns shift depending on which towns recover faster. Some ports regain strength quickly. Others decline. Some regions become more commercially active because survivors and newcomers concentrate there. Other regions become quieter. When you look at Europe from far above, you see movement not only of disease but of people reshaping the map in response to opportunity and fear. But, boring history is not far above. It is close. So let's return to our household again, because that is where the aftermath feels real. Picture a table at night. A smaller group than before. The fire still burns. The bread is on the table. Someone speaks a name that used to be spoken every day. There is a pause. Then someone changes the subject because if you stay in grief too long, you cannot sleep. A child asks if the sickness will come back. The adult answers in a careful way, "We don't know, but we will be ready." That sentence, "we will be ready," is a post-plague sentence. It signals a change. It is not innocence. It is survival knowledge. In Part 7, we will zoom out to track the longer century. How repeated outbreaks shape law and governance, how labor disputes evolve, how the relationship between peasants and lords changes in different regions, and how the Black Death influences the late medieval world in a slow, structural way. We will keep the tone steady and detailed, focusing on daily systems and long-term consequences rather than dramatic scenes. If you want the Black Death to feel like history rather than like a single shocking event, you have to imagine it not as one wave that passes and leaves the shore clean, but as a tide that comes in, retreats, and returns, again and again, in different shapes, in different strengths, for generations, leaving behind a coastline that slowly changes without anyone ever choosing the new shape on purpose. Because after the first massive wave, the medieval world does not become suddenly healthy. It becomes aware. It becomes a world that remembers what a city sounds like when it is frightened, what a market looks like when it is half empty, what a household feels like when the normal number of people at the table is reduced, and what it means to be alive in a society where the future can shrink without warning. That awareness becomes part of daily calculation, like checking the sky for weather, like checking the price of grain, like listening for news from the road. So Part 7 is a slow walk through the long aftermath, not in the sense of one town recovering, but in the sense of an entire century learning new rules about labor, law, authority, and risk. 1. The new shape of work, slowly becoming visible. In the old system, many workers lived inside a tight structure of obligation. A peasant household owed rents, labor service, and rules of movement. An apprentice owed years of work and obedience to become a master. A servant owed loyalty to a household in exchange for protection and food. A tenant owed stability to a lord. The structure was not identical everywhere, but the assumption behind it was common: people were placed, and they stayed placed, because the economy needed predictability, and elites benefited from predictability. After the Black Death, predictability becomes harder to enforce. Labor is scarce, and scarcity changes the mood of negotiation even among people who would not describe their life as negotiation. A farmhand hears, maybe from a cousin, maybe from a traveler, that another estate is offering better terms. A weaver hears that a different town needs skilled hands and is willing to pay. A mason hears that rebuilding projects are beginning and wages are higher. And suddenly the old idea, you must accept what you are given, meets a new idea, they need me. This does not create instant freedom, but it creates friction. And friction creates heat, and heat creates political response. Some lords respond by offering better terms, because practical survival matters more than pride. Some respond by tightening control, because they fear losing the old order. In many regions, the response includes laws designed to freeze wages and restrict mobility. Those laws are not just about money. They are about hierarchy. They are an attempt to say, yes, the world is shaken, but we will not allow the social ladder to wobble. But a law is only a sentence on paper unless it can be enforced, and enforcement requires officials, and officials require stability, and stability is exactly what plague has damaged. Even if a law exists, a lord still needs workers. Even if a city council threatens punishment, the city still needs bread, repairs, sanitation, and trade. Years after the first Great Wave, the Black Death becomes less like a single event and more like a permanent shadow that occasionally grows darker, because the medieval world learns that plague is not only a disaster that arrives once and then leaves forever, but something that can return, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes with a rhythm that people begin to fear in advance. The streets can look normal again, the markets can fill, the ovens can burn, the ships can arrive, and yet the sense of safety is no longer innocent, because innocence is difficult to rebuild once a community has watched its own routines collapse under pressure. In this later period, one of the most important changes is that people begin to carry two lives in the same body, the ordinary life and the emergency life, and they switch between them quickly. In ordinary life, you bargain, you work, you argue, you laugh, you complain about weather, you plan weddings, you plan apprenticeships, you think about harvest and rent. In emergency life, your world contracts to a smaller set of questions. Who is sick? Who has traveled? Where did the rumor come from? Should we go to market? Should we send the child to a neighbor? Should we close the shop? Should we leave town? Should we stay? Should we pray more? Should we avoid church? Should we trust the council? Should we trust anyone? The frightening part is not only the plague itself, but the speed of the switch, the way a community can move from ordinary to emergency in a few days, as if a hidden lever has been pulled. This constant possibility reshapes behavior without needing to announce itself. It shapes how people store food, how people respond to strangers, how people treat the idea of travel. A merchant who once thought only of profit now also thinks of risk, not just the risk of bandits or storms, but the risk of sickness following the same roads as commerce. A city official who once worried mostly about taxes and walls now also worries about the invisible border that is harder to guard than stone. A family that once thought about winter now thinks about sudden illness, because winter is predictable, but plague is not. And yet, even with this fear, life still insists on continuing, because the medieval world cannot pause for long. Trade must resume because cities cannot feed themselves without it. Fields must be worked because hunger is still a threat, and hunger is a familiar enemy that people understand in their bones. Workshops must operate because tools and clothing and repairs do not appear by prayer alone. So the world rebuilds the same connections that once carried danger, because those connections also carry survival, and the irony of that is something people may feel even if they cannot fully articulate it. They might say it in smaller ways. A nervous glance at a ship, a hesitation before accepting a traveler into the home, a whispered complaint that the road brings trouble, even as the same road brings money. In towns that recover, you begin to see the quiet rearrangement of property and role. Shops reopen with different names above the doors. Apprentices become masters sooner than tradition would have allowed. Widows continue businesses not because society suddenly becomes progressive, but because the economy needs functioning units, and a household that can produce and sell becomes valuable, and value can sometimes override custom when custom is inconvenient. Children inherit responsibilities early. A 14-year-old might be doing tasks that once belonged to a grown man, not because the child is ready, but because the world is short of ready people. These shifts create a new kind of maturity, one shaped by necessity rather than age. In this environment, labor becomes a constant point of tension, but it rarely appears as a dramatic confrontation every day. More often it appears as a slow, stubborn negotiation, the way a river negotiates with its banks. A worker asks for more, perhaps politely, perhaps bluntly. An employer complains, perhaps loudly, perhaps in private. Authorities try to set limits, but limits are difficult when scarcity is real. A law can declare that wages should not rise, but a field still needs planting, and a city still needs repairs, and a bakery still needs hands. So the law becomes one voice among many voices, and sometimes it wins, sometimes it loses, and often it creates an atmosphere of conflict even when people are trying to behave normally. The conflict also changes how people think about fairness. Before the plague, hierarchy can feel like nature, like the weather, like the way stones sit beneath soil. After the plague, hierarchy still exists, but it is harder to believe it is natural when the powerful also look frightened, when the rich also lose family members, when the church also struggles, when councils also make desperate decisions. A catastrophe does not erase inequality, but it can weaken the invisible story that inequality is unchangeable. It can make people privately think, even if they never say it aloud, that the world might be negotiable, that power depends on circumstances, that circumstances can change, and that survival sometimes gives you a strange kind of leverage. But leverage is dangerous to hold openly, because the powerful do not disappear, and they do not enjoy being reminded that they need others. So you get a push and pull that lasts for decades, a rhythm of tightening control and slipping free. In some places, that rhythm becomes harsh. In other places, it becomes quietly accepted as the new normal, workers demanding more, authorities complaining, employers adjusting, life continuing. The medieval world becomes more tense in its economic relationships, because scarcity makes every role feel more valuable, and when roles feel more valuable, people care more about terms. Meanwhile, the repeated presence of plague changes the emotional map of community life. Certain social rituals become complicated. A festival can still happen, but it can feel fragile, as if joy is being allowed on a temporary permit. A church service can still be full, but people may glance at coughs. A market can still be crowded, but in the back of the mind there is the memory that crowding once led to grief. People become more watchful, and watchfulness changes how kindness works. Helping a sick neighbor becomes a moral act and a risk at the same time. Visiting the elderly becomes both duty and fear. Even love can carry a new calculation: do we meet, do we touch, do we bring the child to see the relatives, do we travel for a wedding, do we delay? The plague quietly pushes itself into decisions that used to be simpler. Authorities and institutions also develop habits, not always effective, but consistent. They become quicker to announce restrictions when rumors rise. They become quicker to limit travel in certain circumstances. They become quicker to treat outsiders as a problem, which can sometimes reduce risk but also increases suspicion and injustice. They create lists, rules, waiting periods, inspections, and small systems of monitoring, because monitoring feels like control, and control feels like protection. But monitoring can also fail, because it requires honesty, and honesty is harder when people are afraid of being locked inside their home or losing their income. So people learn to speak in half-truths. A household might hide a mild sickness at first because they fear consequences. A worker might avoid reporting symptoms because missing work means missing bread. A merchant might avoid admitting where he has traveled because he fears being refused entry. These behaviors are not simply selfishness, they are survival instincts inside a system where the penalty for honesty can be severe. And that creates another layer of difficulty. When people hide information, authorities respond with harsher rules, and harsher rules create more hiding, and the cycle tightens like a rope. At the same time, medicine remains present, and it remains a mixture of observation, tradition, and hope. People continue to treat air and smell as important, and so they burn aromatics, they carry herbs, they clean spaces when they can, they avoid foul places when possible, they try diets and routines meant to keep the body balanced. The idea of balance becomes comforting, because balance suggests that health is something you can maintain through discipline, and discipline is one of the few things a person can control. Even if the true mechanism is unknown, the psychological need for a controllable framework is powerful, and medieval medicine provides one. Religion, too, provides a framework, but it becomes emotionally layered. After repeated outbreaks, people can become deeply devoted and deeply tired at the same time. They might pray more, but also feel frustration when prayer does not prevent loss. They might attend rituals, but also fear crowds. They might donate to the church, but also question certain leaders. Faith becomes less simple, not necessarily less strong, but more complicated, because repeated suffering forces repeated questions, and repeated questions do not always produce comfortable answers. And through all of this, the Black Death becomes a part of the way people talk about the world, not as a subject of constant conversation, but as a reference point for what can happen. A mother warning a child about cleanliness might reference the last sickness. A merchant negotiating a price might mention the disruption of plague years. A landlord complaining about labor might blame the plague for changing people. A worker might quietly say that after what happened, nothing should be taken for granted. A preacher might frame plague as a reminder to live correctly. The plague becomes a shared memory, and shared memories shape culture like water shapes stone, slowly and persistently. In the long run, this is how the medieval world is reshaped, not only through death, but through the habits and tensions that remain afterward. The Black Death becomes a constant influence on how society organizes work, how it thinks about authority, how it manages fear, how it defines normality. It teaches communities that stability is fragile, and when stability is fragile, people value different things. Some value security more. Some value freedom more. Some value faith more. Some value wealth more. Some value family more. None of these priorities is new, but the weight of each one shifts, like a scale being adjusted. And if you stand in a city decades after the first outbreak, on an ordinary evening, you might see all of this without any dramatic sign. You might see a worker closing a shop and counting coins, aware that his labor is worth more than it used to be. You might see an official reading a notice about travelers, because the city has learned to fear what arrives from outside. You might see a priest walking home, tired, because the spiritual burden did not end when the worst wave ended. You might see children playing, because children always play, but you might also see adults watching them with a particular kind of protective attention, shaped by a memory that the world can become dangerous quickly. And that evening looks calm. The sky is still the sky. The stones are still the stones. The bells ring at familiar hours. The market's noise fades as it always does. Yet under that calm, there is a new layer. The knowledge that ordinary life can be interrupted, that the future is not guaranteed, and that society is held together not by certainty, but by the daily decision to continue anyway. In Part 9, we can move closer again to the intimate scale, and do a slow, detailed day in the life of a post-plague town during a later, smaller outbreak, showing how people who have memory respond differently than those who experienced the first wave, how rules snap into place faster, how rumor spreads faster, how avoidance becomes habit, and how the community tries to keep markets and work functioning while fear tries to shrink the world again. A later outbreak does not arrive in a world that is innocent. It arrives in a world that has already rehearsed fear, and rehearsal changes everything. The first time a community faces plague, the danger can feel unbelievable until it is close. The later times, the danger can feel believable too early, because memory makes people alert, and alertness makes rumor powerful. A single cough can feel like a warning bell. A single traveler's story can shift a market's mood. A single household closing its shutters can make a street feel colder, because closures are no longer just private decisions, they are signals. So let's enter a post-plague town on an ordinary morning, years after the great first wave, when the town has rebuilt enough that life looks normal again. The market is active. The workshop fires burn. The streets are still narrow and familiar. The smell of bread is still present. The town is not wealthy, but it functions. It has learned to function with a missing layer, the missing layer of people who never returned, and with a new layer, the layer of caution that settled into habits like dust in corners. The morning begins with small routines. A baker opens the shutters and checks the flour, because flour is not just flour, it is tomorrow's bread and tomorrow's income. A cobbler sets out tools and listens for customers. A woman carries a bucket from the well, not because she enjoys it, but because water is daily life. A child is told to stay close, and the tone of that instruction is sharper than it might have been before the plague years, because adults have learned what it feels like to lose control. A traveler arrives at the gate and answers questions from a guard, questions that used to be casual and are now more pointed, because the town has learned to treat outsiders as both opportunity and risk. At first, the rumor is not official. It is not posted on a wall. It is spoken in a half voice. Someone says they heard that a neighboring village has sickness. Someone says a merchant from the coast mentioned trouble in a port. Someone says a priest heard that a town 2 days away has increased burials. No one knows if it is true. But the rumor lands differently than it would have in a world without memory. It lands like a spark on dry grass. People begin to watch more carefully. This watchfulness changes behavior in ways that are almost invisible if you do not know what to look for. People buy a little more food than usual. People avoid lingering in the market longer than necessary. People keep distance without calling it distance. People begin to change routes through the town, choosing less crowded streets. People speak more quietly about health. They look at each other's faces, trying to read danger in color and sweat. They notice coughs. They notice fatigue. They notice who did not show up to work. And because the town has learned that fear itself can collapse the economy, some people react with stubborn normality. A merchant insists that trade must continue. A guild member insists that work must continue. A landlord insists that rents must still be paid. There is a tension between caution and denial, not because anyone is foolish, but because both instincts are survival instincts. Caution says, protect the body. Denial says, protect the livelihood. When a community is poor enough, livelihood and body are not separate. Losing work can be a slow death, so fear of disease and fear of hunger can compete inside the same person. As the day moves forward, the town council hears the same rumors. They gather in a room that smells of wax and wood and ink. They argue. They consult whatever information they have, which is not much. They remember the past. They remember what happened when they acted too late. They also remember what happened when they acted too harshly: unrest, hunger, anger, people hiding symptoms. So they weigh choices that are all imperfect. They might decide to post warnings, avoid gatherings, be cautious, report illness, limit travel. They might instruct gate guards to question travelers more strictly. They might ask certain groups to avoid moving between towns. They might ask for cleaning in certain places. They might encourage prayers or public rituals. They might try to regulate markets by spacing stalls differently. Each action is an attempt to slow the invisible thing by adjusting the visible world. But these actions have consequences. If the council tightens control too much, merchants complain, because trade is the town's oxygen. If the council tightens control too much, workers complain, because stopping work means hunger. If the council tightens control too much, people hide sickness because they fear being locked in. And when people hide sickness, the council loses visibility, which makes the council feel powerless, which makes it more likely to tighten control further. The town can become trapped in a cycle of fear and enforcement. Meanwhile, the church responds in its own way. A priest may preach caution or repentance or both. There may be extra prayers. There may be calls for fasting. Some people attend more because anxiety pushes them toward ritual. Some attend less because crowds feel dangerous. The church is both a place of comfort and a place of contact, and those two truths collide. The same candle that symbolizes hope is held in a room full of breathing bodies, and breathing bodies are now part of the town's worry. In households, the change is practical. People relearn their emergency habits. They check stored food. They prepare simple medicines. They burn aromatic substances because they believe smell and air matter. They clean more carefully when they can. They instruct children not to wander. They avoid visiting relatives. They avoid receiving visitors. They reduce social life to the smallest circle possible, because circles feel safer than crowds. This reduction is emotionally expensive. A town is built on social density, on neighborly contact. When contact shrinks, loneliness grows. People feel isolated while still surrounded by walls and streets. They hear voices less often. They hear bells more clearly. They sit by fires and listen to the outside world like it is an animal in the dark. They become suspicious. They become tired. They become quiet. In the market, the second day of rumor looks different from the first. Prices shift. Some goods sell faster because people want to prepare. Some sellers withdraw because they fear exposure. Some buyers stay away because they fear crowds. If the rumor continues, the market can become a place of tension. A seller might accuse a buyer of bringing sickness. A buyer might accuse a seller of hiding illness. Trust is fragile, and once trust breaks, every cough becomes an accusation. If an actual illness appears, if a household reports serious sickness, then the town's emotional temperature rises quickly. The shutters close faster. Neighbors avoid that street. People speak the household's name quietly. The council may send someone to investigate. The investigator may fear the task. The household may fear the investigator. Everyone is frightened in different directions. And this is where the later outbreaks reveal something important. Communities learn to respond faster, but faster is not always better. A fast response can slow spread. A fast response can also produce panic. A fast response can also produce scapegoating, because fear is quicker than patience, and fear wants certainty immediately. So rumors can become blame. Outsiders can become suspect. Marginal groups can become targets. A town that feels threatened may look for someone to punish, because punishment creates the illusion that the threat has a face and can be fought. This is one of the most dangerous social reactions, and it can appear in later outbreaks with less hesitation, because memory not only teaches caution, it also teaches how quickly a community can become desperate. At the same time, you also see compassion sharpen. Some people volunteer to help. Some people deliver food to sick households while keeping distance. Some people take on dangerous work because someone must. Some clergy continue visiting the ill. Some healers continue treating. A disaster can reveal both cruelty and courage in the same street. And always, beneath the visible behavior, the economic pressure is constant. The town cannot feed itself without trade. It cannot maintain itself without labor. So even in fear, people keep doing necessary tasks. A water carrier still carries water. A baker still bakes bread. A farmer still brings produce, though perhaps he leaves it at the edge of town rather than entering fully. A messenger still travels. A guard still watches. Life persists, because it must. If the outbreak grows, then the town begins to enter the older, familiar rhythm of plague time: fewer gatherings, more rules, more suspicion, more strain. But if the outbreak remains small, the town lives in a state of tense waiting, like someone holding their breath. That waiting is its own suffering. It exhausts people. It changes mood. It turns ordinary annoyance into anger. It makes small disputes larger. It makes people impatient with each other. It makes kindness harder, because kindness requires emotional surplus, and fear consumes surplus. And after the rumor passes, after the outbreak proves small, or after it fades, the town does not return to normal immediately. It returns slowly, like a body returning to movement after being stiff. People reopen social life carefully. They retrust crowds slowly. They replan travel cautiously. And each time they go through this cycle, the habit becomes deeper: ordinary life and emergency life, switching back and forth, shaping a generation. This is how the Black Death becomes more than the initial catastrophe. It becomes a long condition. It teaches communities to live with uncertainty, to build rules and habits around an invisible threat, to negotiate between survival of the body and survival of the economy, and to accept that stability is not a permanent state, but a temporary achievement.